she just talks, but I'm just an underpaid, non-paid, retired, non-paid academic. So I have to have a script. And strangely enough, Carnegie was right. You know, I'm unaccustomedly nervous about this. So
lean on up.
All bullying would be welcome. Okay, so we agreed on two things before we started this evening. First of all, that we're not going to thank anybody, but I'm actually going to lie. I lie. Okay, so I want to thank two groups of people. One is I want to thank Unisa Press because we were picky, difficult, irascible authors, and they were very gracious and patient with us. And I say we because Mary is very precatory, but less precatory. So Mary can say, don't say that. So thank you so much for putting up with us and for producing such a great book. And the other one I want to thank is Mary, because it was Mary, you've challenged me and you've given me a lot to learn about, a lot to think about, and some great friendships and a lot of fun. I mean, all those little seaside towns we went to in Ireland and all those pub dinners that we had. It was fun. But anyway, so we decided that Mary would talk about people and I would talk about spaces and places. So that's more or less what I want to talk about tonight. So when we visited, as Mary said, we visit museums including District 6 Museum in Cape Town and the Museum of Free Derry in Derry, Londonderry in Northern Ireland. And these museums, like other sites of conscience, commemorate and communicate memory of community injustices in recent times. Now, Mary's spoken about the experiences of some of the storyteller guys and the various places that we went, and I'm going to be talking about the spaces and the meanings of these particular spaces. Now, the museums and places of memory we discuss in the book all have a common thread of being places where something traumatic happened to some people in the past, and these events or these series of events have been memorialized in the construction, both material and in terms of ideological meaning making in a fixed structure of some kind. And that's what I want to talk about. So the first consideration we should ask, therefore, is why are certain events in certain places and certain circumstances are chosen to be remembered and others are ignored or neglected or fall into disuse? And with all the phenomenon of collective memory, that is, by what we mean by collective memory, is a congealed and frequently mythologized account of what has happened in the past. Memorialization is largely driven by the concerns of the present rather than the past. So collective memory and cultural identity and commemoration are all intertwined. And a series of collective memory will tell you what is remembered and what is forgotten, and what is repressed has much more to do with what is happening now than what happened in the past. Thus, for a site to be commemorated, there must be a group of people within the current time who are interested in pursuing the project of keeping that past alive. And frequently, in many of the places we went to, this starts with a small group of people who are directly or perhaps indirectly have an interest in the events that are commemorated. And in our sample, some of the people had first or at least second generation connections. And probably the best examples of that were in the Museum of Free Derry that Mary has already mentioned, which was established by the relatives of those caught up in the so-called Troubles of the late 1960s and early 1970s in Ireland, which for Londonderry culminated in the Battle of the Bog and later Bloody Sunday, an event that is enshrined in the name of the Bloody Sunday Trust, the group that now owns the museum. Today it is still run by relatives and by immediate neighbours of the relatives of that particular area. Now, Kilmainham Jail in Dublin is best remembered as a site of political incarceration during a series of political conflicts. The 1916 Easter Rising, the Anglo-Irish War of 1919 to 1921, and of course the tragic outcome of the Irish Civil War of 1922 and 1923. After that, the building was closed until, it was closed in 1924, but it was preserved as a national monument, quietly disintegrating behind its forbidding walls. In the 1960s, a Kilmainham Restoration Committee, who was an activist group driven by the need to preserve the memory of the martyrs, restored it with their own labour and raised the money to do so privately. And it was only later, much later, that it was taken over by the, hang on, I'll get to that now. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. So in South Africa, the District 6 museums Mary mentioned were started by people who had previously lived in the area before the forced removals. And this is the core of people who still run it today. Robben Island Museum was initially run by a board that consisted of ex-prisoners and ex-wardens. Crumlin Road Jail in Belfast was run by a trust of and staffed by ex-warders. Thus, for many of the places that we visited, a small group of community members or like-minded individuals were responsible for the identification and the establishment of the places we visited. Now, the second issue that I want to talk about is a generational one. What happens when the original instigators move on? And that happens. Related to this, how do these museums remain sustainable? Now, in the book, we explore the ways in which community-level museums can change into local history museums and then even national museums. Free Derry and District 6 remain in the hands of private trusts, but Kilmainham has become the responsibility, for instance, of the Irish Office of Public Works in 1986. Now, the places we visited are not just buildings. The structures create meaning through very deliberate choices, and I'm talking to museumologists, so why am I telling you this? So they're created through very deliberate choices, through the selection and the curation of objects, the design and exhibition, and even the soundtrack that accompanies the items, and they all tell a particular story. They're not neutral, they tell a particular story. Just as the storyteller guides weave their narratives, so the material traces left in the museums. What is shown in the display cabinets is a reflection not only of what happened way back then, but it is also important now. As time elapses, the audience of the museums become wider, and the issues become more universal. So the work of keeping sectarian, clannish, and ethnic identities intact is diluted as other issues nudge in. So you can think of the Voortrekker Monument, for instance, which was very clannish, and is now not. It's very wide, and it reaches out to a much broader audience. So the fight against injustice takes on a wider, more comparative aspect, and guest-curated exhibitions are hosted and swapped. And we mentioned quite a few of those in the book. I just want to talk a little bit about one particular museum that I think really spoke to me very particularly, and that was Constitution Hill in Johannesburg, which is made up of a series of different spaces, each of them with their own look and their own feel. And I'm talking also about the design elements of what do you do with these derelict buildings? How do you bring them to life? Or how do you make them speak? Because if storyteller guides are telling a story, so are the artifacts, so are the material buildings that are actually in which they are housed. So the very famous part is the awaiting trial section, which houses the most gut-wrenching exhibitions, not only for political prisoners, but for many thousands of everyday people who were churned through these cells: thieves, rogues, gang members, and pass offenders. The old fort, the oldest part of the prison, which goes right back to before the Boer War, and was used more recently to house white male inmates towards the end of the building's life, celebrates the life and work of several individual prisoners. Each of his 12 isolation cells houses a different exhibition centered on a particular person, each quite different. The women's prison houses a series of NGOs and activist groups in the field of social justice. But it is the glorious triple-volumed Constitution Court that is the gem of the precinct. Filled with international gallery worth art, it is a celebration of colour, of talent, and certainly of hope. Now, all these sites that we visited, have what we refer to as a spirit of the place. They're not just a collection of buildings and statues and artifacts woven into a story. They are, in their own way, a semi-living spiritual entity. And that sounds really strange coming from me. No, really. I mean, I'm a theorist and a skeptic. So why would I say this? But you cannot stand in the middle of the wagon circle at Blood River without feeling the presence of thousands of warriors coming out of the mists across the hill, or forging what are now puddles in the Nkomo River, where cows today are placidly grazing. That spirit is there. Their spirit is there, just as their blood was spilled there. The peace rivers that are built at Nkomo and at Derry are not only clever metaphors, there are real connections between feuding groups. And when we are honest with ourselves, the right to reserve, those groups reserve the right to see themselves and to consider themselves as different to those that are on the other side of the river, even today. Which brings me to my final point, and I think that's my 9 minutes. So this brings me to my final point about these really great places. What if they're aesthetic? Many buildings showcase what is called a studied dereliction that is part of their heritage, and frankly, their charm. If Robben Island prison cells were totted up and spruced neatly and painted, they would simply not have their present mystique. However, such physical distress isn't sustainable, and I'm sure that Mr. Ngubane knows that. Buildings need to be maintained, or they collapse. And others, for all their horror, their tragedy, their injustice and their trauma, are frankly gorgeous. The Tree of Justice that soars above the foyer of the Constitution Court and the three Victorian prisons that we visited, Kilmainham, Cumberland Road, and the Women's Prison on Constitutional Hill, all sport magnificent vaulted metal staircases and huge light-filled atriums. As one of our people told us, when we went there, every day she goes through and she strokes the stones and she says, "Come on, girl, today we're going to give them their best show yet." So the events that are commemorated by the museums we visited are reimagined and reiterated over time. Once when they happened, once when the memorials in the museums were established, and then at numerous intervals as time and circumstances dictate. In the process, they morph, they change to accommodate new audiences, new management, new revenue streams, and new meanings. Thank you.